Grand Marshal Vekthar San was laughing when the deadline expired. Not the polite laughter of a commander performing confidence for his crew. Not the measured chuckle of a diplomat making a point. This was the deep, unguarded laughter of a man who had spent 41 years being right about everything that mattered and had just been handed one more piece of evidence that the universe intended to keep it that way. He was on his third listening of the human transmission. The bridge of the Imperial Dreadnought, Sovereign's Wrath, stretched 400 meters from bow to stern, and every surface of it radiated purpose. Amber light pulsed through the tactical arrays. Crimson threat indicators painted the air above 17 different stations. The smell of recycled atmosphere and charged weapon systems hung over everything, that particular combination that Sun had come to associate not with danger but with dominance. He had commanded from bridges like this one for 4 decades. He had stood in that exact spot at the center of that exact light and watched empires smaller than his own make the mistake of thinking his patience was weakness. 317 warships surrounded the threshold system. 317. The largest battle group the Vekthari Dominion had assembled since the Kethran pacification 40 years ago. Arrayed in overlapping defensive spheres around the gas giant the humans called Threshold Prime, each vessel a masterwork of Dominion engineering, each crew trained to the edge of their capabilities, each weapon system primed and ready. From the outer picket lines to the inner guard formation around the 3 colonial habitats, the Third Armada covered every approach vector, every escape route, every angle of attack that any military mind in the known galaxy might conceive. Against this, the humans had sent a message. San gestured to his communications officer, a young male whose scales still carried the bright green of recent academy graduation. The officer complied without a word. For the third time, the holographic display at the center of the bridge filled with the face of Ambassador Petra Vane. She was young by human standards. Dark hair, pale complexion. The particular combination of features that intelligence briefings classified as Northern European ancestry. She wore a diplomatic uniform rather than a military one, though San had learned over 12 years of studying this species that the distinction often meant less than it appeared. Her expression was composed in a way that should have read as professional neutrality. Instead, and this was the detail that kept pulling at him, it read as something else entirely. She didn't look nervous. Ambassadors delivering ultimatums to 300 warships looked nervous. That was physics. That was the inevitable product of standing at the intersection of your species' future and an overwhelming military force. Every ambassador San had ever faced across a negotiating table or a holographic display had carried some version of the same thing in their eyes. Fear or the effort to conceal it, which amounted to the same thing. Petra Vane looked like a woman reading a weather report. "This is Ambassador Petra Vane of the Terran Compact," she said for the third time. "You are in occupation of the threshold system in violation of established colonial treaties. We are formally requesting your immediate withdrawal. You have 72 hours to comply. If you do not comply, we will be forced to dispatch 1 fleet to secure the system and enforce the treaty terms. This constitutes your formal warning." Vane out, the transmission ended. Sun's laughter filled the bridge again, and this time his senior staff joined him. Subcommander Drev Ice allowed himself a thin smile, though his was the careful kind, the smile of a man who laughed because his commander was laughing rather than because he found something funny. Battle Coordinator Vron, Tess actually clicked her secondary jaw plates, the Vekthari equivalent of a genuine chuckle. Even the weapons officers trained to stoicism exchanged the quick glances of people sharing a private joke. 1 fleet. Sun stood from his command throne and walked to the primary viewport. The reinforced crystal stretched 20 meters across the bridge's forward face, and through it, the threshold system spread out in all its contested glory. Threshold Prime dominated the view, the gas giant's rings catching the distant sun and scattering it into bands of amber and silver. 3 colonial habitats orbited the planet in precise formation, each one currently under Dominion administration. The human settlers had been relocated with minimal disruption. Their protests had been noted. Their protests had been filed. The mining rights to the system were worth the diplomatic friction. San had been certain of that when Arch-Chancellor Morvan Seal had given him the order, and nothing in the 72 hours since had changed his assessment. Subcommander Ice appeared at his shoulder, moving with the quiet efficiency that San had come to rely on across 12 years of service together. Ice was younger than San by nearly 2 decades, his scales still carrying the deep green of mid-career health, but he had a mind that processed tactical data the way water found cracks in stone, quietly, persistently, without drama. "Intelligence assessment," San said, not looking away from the viewport. Ice activated his personal display. Numbers materialized in the air between them. Terran compact total naval strength, current estimate, approximately 200 vessels. Distributed across 17 adjacent sectors. No single concentration above 30 ships within any monitored zone. Best case deployment scenario for a response force targeting the threshold system, a minimum of 6 jump point transits, estimated travel time 14 to 18 standard hours, assuming they began moving at the moment the ultimatum was delivered. Which they didn't, Vron said from her station. Which they didn't, ICE confirmed. Long-range monitoring shows no unusual fleet movements in any adjacent sector as of 6 hours ago. Sun turned away from the viewport. One fleet, based on what we know of their formation doctrine, how many vessels does that represent? ICE pulled the relevant data. Observed human fleet configurations range from 15 to 30 vessels, typically organized around a cruiser-destroyer mixed core with frigate support elements. The word fleet in their tactical lexicon appears to correspond to what we would classify as a medium task force. Son looked at his sub-commander. 30 ships drive against 317. EC nodded slowly. The numbers are not in their favor, sir. There was something else Son wanted to examine, though he hadn't articulated it yet, even to himself. Something in the precise wording of the ultimatum that sat at the edge of his attention like a splinter he couldn't locate. He let it sit there while he walked back to his command throne and settled into it. Around him, the bridge continued its work. Sensor sweeps, weapons checks, the quiet, efficient machinery of a military force at the absolute peak of its confidence. We will record the sensor logs through the deadline, Son said. Complete documentation. When no fleet arrives, we transmit the logs to the diplomatic corps along with our formal response. The humans need to understand that an empty threat has consequences. As you command, sir. Vron began configuring the recording protocols. Son's gaze drifted back to the space where the holographic display had shown Petrovan's face. He had reviewed the intelligence files on the Terran Compact's diplomatic corps twice since receiving the transmission. Vane was 34 years old by human reckoning. She had served as attaché on 3 previous missions, all of them routine treaty negotiations involving resource rights in border systems. Nothing in her records suggested experience with military confrontations. Nothing suggested she had ever delivered an ultimatum to anyone, let alone to 300 warships. And yet she hadn't looked nervous. Son said, sir, the word fleet in the transmission. She didn't say a fleet of ships. She didn't say a military force. She said specifically, one fleet. Ice was quiet for a moment. I noticed that as well, sir. The specificity is unusual for a diplomatic communication. Typically, representatives in her position use broader language to preserve negotiating flexibility. The precision could indicate a formal military designation rather than a casual numerical reference. Or it could mean exactly what it says Vron offered from her station and nothing more. Son nodded. That was the more likely interpretation. He knew that. But the splinter remained. 30 minutes before the deadline, the second communication arrived. It came through standard diplomatic channels rather than the emergency frequency, which meant it had been composed and sent with time to spare rather than urgency. That detail alone was worth noting. Petrovane appeared on the holographic display again, same composure, same weather report delivery. Grand Marshal Son. This is a supplemental communication regarding our previous notice. The Terran Compact wishes to emphasize that our request for your withdrawal from the threshold system remains active and sincere. We have been prepared for this contingency for 43 years. You have 24 hours remaining under the original timeline. I would encourage you to use them. Vane out. The laughter on the bridge this time was shorter, more contained. 43 years, Vron said, testing the number out loud, the way you tested the weight of something before deciding whether to pick it up. The Terran Compact has been part of the galactic community for 12 years, Ice said carefully. They're claiming preparation that predates their own public arrival by 31 years. Son stared at the empty display. Prepared for what contingency exactly? We weren't there 43 years ago. We had no contact with their species until 12 years ago. No one answered because no one had an answer. 43 years ago, Son thought. He had been 21 years old, a junior tactical officer on a border patrol vessel, running standard routes through systems that weren't worth arguing over. 43 years ago, the humans had been a single-planet species with no confirmed faster-than-light capability, no galactic presence, no existence in anyone's strategic calculations whatsoever. And they were already preparing. For what? The splinter buried itself a little deeper. Then 15 minutes before the deadline, something happened that Son had not expected and that no one on the bridge was quite sure how to categorize. Long-range monitoring Station 7, positioned at the outer boundary of the system's sensor perimeter, reported a contact. The contact was not a ship emerging from a jump point. It was a signal, brief and fragmentary, caught on a secondary frequency that the station used for background traffic analysis rather than active monitoring. The signals officer brought it to ICE and ICE brought it to Sun. It was a voice. A woman's voice, unidentified, issuing what sounded like preparatory orders to a crew. The transmission lasted 11 seconds before the signal dropped. The content was operational rather than diplomatic references to system status, readiness confirmations, the compressed shorthand of a professional directing people who already understood the context. The direction of the signal was unmistakable. It had originated from somewhere in the outer system well beyond the boundary of any known approach vector. "They've already moved," Ice said quietly. "Whoever she is, sir. She was already moving before the deadline." Sun looked at his subcommander. "How long before the deadline did that signal originate?" Ice checked the timestamp against the transmission logs and looked up with an expression that contained, for the first time all day, something that was not quite amusement. "Based on the propagation delay, sir, that signal was sent approximately 14 hours ago." 14 hours, before Vane's supplemental communication. Before anyone in this room had any reason to believe the humans were doing anything other than composing their concession. Sun filed the information. He had no immediate use for it, but he was a man who had learned that unexplained details had a way of becoming relevant. The chronometer reached 0. Nothing appeared off the main sensor display. The Third Armada held its formation. The bridge was quiet, with the particular quiet of people who had expected nothing and received it. Sun allowed himself a long, slow breath of satisfaction. "As expected," he said. "Sir," the sensor officer's voice cut through the bridge's quiet confidence with a quality that stopped every other sound in the room. "Contact, single energy signature, system edge, bearing 273 Mark 15, distance 42 million kilometers." The officer's claws slowed over his console. "Sir, the mass displacement on this contact is reading equivalent to a Class 7 orbital installation. A Class 7 installation massed roughly 400,000 metric tons. It was the size of a minor moon. It was not something that moved through a jump point under its own power." "Recalibrate," Sun said. "Already running, sir." The recalibration confirmed the original reading. His voice dropped. "It's a single object, and it is moving at 0.72 light speed in real space." The bridge absorbed that in silence. 0.72 light speed in real space was not a number that appeared in any vessel classification database. It was a number that appeared in theoretical physics discussions about what would be required in energy terms to move mass at that velocity, and the result of those calculations was a figure that had no practical application, because nothing anyone had built could get anywhere near it. Something had. "Identification," someone said. The IFF query went out. The response returned at second 4. The sensor officer ratted aloud because he seemed to understand intuitively that this was the kind of information that needed to be heard rather than simply processed. "USS Resolute, Titan-class fleet carrier. Terran Compact Naval Registry." He paused. "Commission date 43 years ago." The number landed in the chamber like a dropped weight. ASS said nothing. He looked at the sensor reading, then at Sun, then back at the sensor reading with the expression of a man assembling a puzzle whose final image he was not sure he wanted to see completely formed. 43 years, Ron said. "That's the same number." Sun was already moving. "All ships to battle stations. Prepare intercept formation." 50 vessels, standard envelope configuration, close to 8,000 kilometers in hold. As the bridge shifted into full combat readiness around him, as 317 warships began the precise choreography of assuming assault positions, as the tactical display filled with the movement of his forces and the single unmoved contact marker of the USS Resolute at the system's edge. San stood at the center of it all and did the arithmetic that no one else on the bridge was quite ready to do yet. 43 years ago, the humans had commissioned a ship. 31 years before making contact with the galactic community. They had built it before anyone in the galaxy knew they existed, before the Dominion had a name for them, before there was any specific adversary to prepare against. They hadn't been preparing for the Vecthari Dominion. They had been preparing for anyone. The USS Resolute crossed 40 million kilometers, then 35, then 30. It moved through the outer picket line of the Third Armada with the complete indifference of something that had not registered the picket line as a factor worth calculating around. 47 warships positioned in overlapping fields of fire, and the contact marker drew a straight line through them toward Threshold Prime, as if they were suggestions rather than obstacles. "Approach velocity decreasing," the sensor officer reported. "They're decelerating." Estimated arrival at engagement range in 31 minutes. Projected final position. Orbital insertion above threshold prime. They're placing themselves between the colonial habitats and our main force. Of course they were. Ice appeared at Sun's side. His voice was carefully controlled in the way that voices became carefully controlled when the person speaking had run a calculation and did not like the result. Sir, I've been mapping the dimensional profile from the mass displacement readings. Put it on the display. The comparison image appeared on the main viewer. On the left, the silhouette of the Sovereign's Wrath, 2 kilometers of Dominion, engineering the heaviest ship in the Third Armada, the vessel that had served as Sun's flagship for 11 years, and that he had always thought of without quite articulating the thought as the definitive expression of what a warship was. On the right, the dimensional profile extrapolated from the USS Resolute's sensor readings. The rendering took a moment to complete. When it did, someone on the bridge made a sound that wasn't quite a word. The Sovereign's Wrath, 2 kilometers of pride in history, looked like a service shuttle parked beside a naval station. The proportions had a quality of wrongness about them, not because the numbers were uncertain, but because the numbers were confirmed. 43 kilometers in length, 19 kilometers at maximum beam, 8.7 kilometers from keel to top. Those were the dimensions of something that existed in a different category from the word warship. Those were the dimensions of something that the word warship had not been designed to describe. It's a city, Vron said very quietly. It's a flying city. It's a fleet carrier, Ice said. His voice had achieved a steadiness that San recognized as costing him something. The designation means it carries subordinate craft. That hull could contain hundreds of smaller vessels. It's not just one ship. It's a mobile operations base. Sun looked at the comparison image for a moment. Then he made himself look away because the productive response to an unexpected tactical situation was not to stare at what you didn't expect. The productive response was to engage it. 50 vessels at 8,000 kilometers, he said. Hold position. Open communications when they reach orbital insertion. The 50-ship intercept group swept into formation around the USS Resolute's projected path with the precision that Dominion naval doctrine had refined across 4,000 years of continuous development. Sun watched them move on the tactical display and noticed for the first time in a very long while that the geometry of his formation felt less absolute than it usually did. At 28 million kilometers, the USS Resolute's communication systems reached across the distance between them and opened a channel with the Sovereign's Wrath. Not in response to a hail, not through the standard protocol sequence of identification and connection. The channel simply opened in the way that a door opens when the person on the other side has a key. The Sovereign's Wrath's communication security was multi-layered, encrypted, with protocols that had not been compromised in 40 years of operational deployment. It opened as though the encryption was a formality that had been noted and set aside. The holographic display filled with a face. She was older than Petra Vane. Gray threaded through dark hair cut short and practical. Lines at the corners of dark eyes that had the quality of lines earned by sustained focus, rather than simply by time. She wore a uniform that was dark and almost deliberately understated, without the decorative elements that Dominion military tradition attached to rank and achievement. The insignia she wore were small and specific, the kind that communicated information to people who already knew what they meant. She was seated in a command chair that bore a structural resemblance to Sun's own throne. Behind her, a bridge spread across multiple levels, dozens of crew members working at stations that glowed with a soft, even blue light. Everything visible was clean, functional, and completely calm. She looked directly at Sun, not approximately at the camera, not in the general direction of the holographic pickup. Directly at him with the focused, precise attention of someone who had spent considerable time determining exactly where he would be standing. Grand Marshal Vector San, she said. Her voice was quiet, and it carried the weight of someone who had never needed to raise it to be heard. I am Fleet Admiral Rhea Harlow of the Terran Compact Naval Command. You were given 72 hours to withdraw your forces from the threshold system and restore the colonial habitats to their residents. You did not withdraw. Sun held himself very still. He was aware of his crew watching him, measuring his response the way crews always measured their commander's response in moments of unexpected pressure. He was also aware of a particular quality in Harlow's voice that he had not heard from a human before, a quality he had heard perhaps 4 or 5 times in 41 years from opponents who were worth the full measure of his attention. She wasn't performing confidence. She had it. Admiral Harlow, he said, you are significantly outnumbered. One ship, however large, cannot engage the Third Armada on favorable terms. I strongly suggest you hold your current position while we discuss a diplomatic resolution. Harlow's expression didn't change. Grand Marshal, she said, you currently have 50 vessels surrounding my ship in what you believe is an intimidation formation. I need you to understand something very clearly. She paused. 1 second. 2. We did not come here to negotiate, she said. We came here to enforce the withdrawal we requested. I am giving you one final opportunity to comply. Behind her on the bridge of a ship that was 43 kilometers long and had been built 31 years before she first appeared in anyone's records, her crew continued their work. Quiet, precise, completely calm. And in that moment, standing at the center of 317 warships that represented the absolute peak of Vekthari Dominion military power, Grand Marshal Vekthar Son felt the first cold touch of something he had not experienced in a very long time. Not fear, not yet. Something older and in many ways more significant. The feeling of a man who has just realized that the information he thought he understood was not in fact the information he had. The 50 Vekthari warships held their position at 8,000 kilometers. On the tactical display, they formed a sphere of overlapping fire coverage around the USS Resolute's orbital insertion point above Threshold Prime, each vessel precisely placed to ensure that any angle of attack or attempt at evasive maneuvering would be met with concentrated weapons fire from at least 6 separate directions simultaneously. It was a textbook envelope formation, the kind taught at every Dominion military academy as the standard response to a superior single vessel. Contain, constrain, demonstrate the mathematics of the situation. The mathematics were 317 to 1. Grand Marshal Son stood at the center of his bridge and watched the USS Resolute settle into its orbital position, and he noticed 2 things that he filed away without yet knowing what to do with. The first was that the vessel had not altered its trajectory by a single degree since entering the system. It had drawn a straight line from the system edge to Threshold Prime and followed that line with the complete indifference of something that had identified the optimal path and seen no reason to consider alternatives. The second was that its external systems had gone very quiet, not the quiet of a vessel powering down, the opposite. The quiet of a vessel that had completed its preparatory configurations and was now simply waiting in the way that a weapon waits after it has been aimed, and the only remaining variable is whether it will be used. Son opened the channel. Harlow appeared on the display. She was standing now rather than seated, which was the only visible change from the previous communication. Behind her, the bridge of the USS Resolute continued its calm, precise work. No one was running. No one was raising their voice. If 317 warships surrounding their vessel at engagement range was creating any measurable tension among her crew, it was not visible on their faces or in their movements. Admiral Harlow Son said, "You are currently surrounded by 50 of my ships at a range of 8,000 kilometers, with the remainder of my force positioned to reinforce within 4 minutes. I want you to consider your situation carefully before this conversation continues." "I have considered it," Harlow said. She clasped her hands behind her back with the ease of someone for whom the gesture was habitual. "Grand Marshal, I am going to say this once clearly because I believe you are a professional, and professionals respond to direct communication. The Threshold system is Terran Compact territory under the terms of the Haversham Colonial Accords, which your government signed 11 years ago. You have displaced our colonists, occupied our habitats, and ignored a formal request to withdraw. I am here to enforce compliance with a treaty your government agreed to." She paused. "I am asking you for the last time to order a full withdrawal from the system, to return the colonial habitats to their residents. Transmit a formal acknowledgement of the treaty violation through standard diplomatic channels. If you do this now, today, this remains a diplomatic incident. If you do not, it becomes something else." Son looked at her, looked past her at the bridge of her ship, at the dozens of crew members going about their work with that eerie professional calm. He thought about the mass displacement readings. He thought about 43, which kept appearing in connection with this vessel, and this species like a detail that was trying to communicate something he wasn't ready to receive. He thought about 41 years and 312 engagements. "Admiral," he said, with respect, "you are giving ultimatums from a vessel surrounded by 50 warships and backed by 267 more. Whatever capabilities your ship possesses, you cannot fight this engagement on terms that favor you. I would ask you to consider the situation from my position." Harlow was quiet for a moment. When she spoke again, something in her voice had shifted very slightly. Not in volume or temperature, in quality. The way a conversation shifts when one participant has finished being patient and moved to being precise. "Grand Marshal," she said, "I am going to ask my weapons officer to bring our defensive screens to standard operational power. I want you to watch your sensor readings when I do. She turned slightly. The movement brought a younger crew member into the edge of the frame, a man at a weapons station looking at his display with the focused attention of someone managing complex systems. Lieutenant Oran, defensive screens to standard operational power. The lieutenant's hands moved across his console. Screens active Admiral, radiating at 18% capacity. Every alarm on the bridge of the Sovereign's Wrath activated simultaneously. Not in sequence. Not the graduated escalation of a sensor array processing unexpected data and flagging it through appropriate channels. All at once, as if the ship's systems had collectively agreed that whatever they were detecting was too significant to handle through normal priority queuing. Sun's sensor officer's voice cracked. Sir, energy spike. The power output from the human vessel just... He stopped. Finish it. Sir, the readings are... He stopped again. The second stop was worse than the first because it wasn't hesitation. It was a man confronting numbers his instruments were producing and his mind was refusing to ratify. He looked up from his console. Sir, the USS Resolute is currently radiating more energy through its defensive screens alone than our entire fleet's combined reactor output. Sun said nothing. These are confirmed readings, the sensor officer continued. I've run the diagnostic twice. The instruments are functioning within normal parameters. What they're reading would require a contained singularity to generate. That's not a reactor. His scales had gone pale along the jawline. Sir, that's a star. On the display, Harlow was watching him. Her expression had not changed. Grand Marshal, she said, what you are seeing is 18% of our defensive capacity. We are running on auxiliary allocation. I want to be transparent with you about what you are dealing with before this situation develops any further. Sun looked at her, he looked at his sensor officer. He looked at the readings on his tactical display, which were continuing to update with information that continued to make less sense by any framework available to him. And then he made a decision. He made it because 41 years of military command had taught him that there were two possible explanations for an apparently impossible tactical situation. The first was that the situation was genuinely as it appeared, in which case the appropriate response was to gather more information before committing to action. The second was that the apparently impossible elements were the product of deception, electronic warfare, sensor spoofing, psychological manipulation designed to create paralysis in the opposing commander. 41 years had also taught him that the second explanation was more common than the first. Genuine impossibilities were rare. Enemy deception operations were routine, Group Captain Dale Sun said. The commander of his 50-ship intercept group responded immediately. Sir, I want a warning shot across the bow of the human vessel. Single particle beam, minimum power, 200 meters clearance from their hull. I want to see how their screens perform against an actual weapons test. There was a pause that lasted approximately 2 seconds longer than acknowledgement protocols required. Sir Dale said carefully, our tactical analysis suggests that engaging the human vessel before we have better data on their actual capabilities may not be the optimal course of action. That was not a request, Group Captain. Understood, sir. Designating firing vessel now. The IDS Crimson Lance was a heavy cruiser positioned at the eastern pole of the intercept formation, one of the newer vessels in the Third Armada. Its particle beam systems were among the most accurate in the fleet. The shot it fired was precisely calibrated, a narrow, focused burst, and carrying enough energy to vaporize a 30-meter section of standard military-grade armor plating aimed to pass within 200 meters of the USS Resolute's forward hull. The beam crossed 8,000 kilometers in the time it took Sun to draw a breath. It struck the USS Resolute's defensive screen and stopped, not deflected, not absorbed in the shower of released energy that typically marked the interaction of a weapons discharge with a shield system. The particle beam struck the outer boundary of the USS Resolute's defensive field and stopped as though space itself had decided the beam was not permitted to continue in its current direction. It hung there, a frozen line of coherent energy, long enough to see clearly, long enough for the mind to process what it was seeing, and then it simply ceased to exist. No dissipation, no residual radiation signature worth recording. The shot had never reached its target, and the target had not been troubled by the attempt. The USS Resolute's screens had not fluctuated by a measurable amount. The bridge of the Sovereign's Wrath was completely silent. Weapons analysis, Son said. His voice came out level. His weapons officer took 4 seconds to respond. Sir, that beam carried sufficient energy to ablate approximately 120 meters of standard Dreadnought-class armor plating. The human screens did not register the impact. No power draw, no fluctuation. The interaction reads as equivalent to firing into a planetary gravity well. The energy didn't deflect or absorb. It nullified. On the display, Fleet Admiral Rhea Harlow's expression had changed, not to anger, not to satisfaction or triumph. What had moved into her face was something that Son needed a moment to identify because he had not expected to see it. Disappointment, not in him specifically, in the situation, in the fact that this was the direction things had moved despite her efforts to steer it elsewhere. It was the expression of someone watching a predictable outcome arrive that they had genuinely hoped would not. Grand Marshal, she said quietly, you just fired on a Terran compact naval vessel. Under our rules of engagement, that constitutes an act of war. She let that sit for one beat. I am going to make an assumption that you did not fully understand what you were testing before you tested it. I am willing to attribute this to a lack of information rather than hostile intent, but only once. Sun looked at her, looked at the readings his sensors were still producing, looked at the empty space where the particle beam had been. Something was happening in his mind that 41 years of military experience was working very hard to prevent. The careful architecture of certainty that he had built across 4 decades was encountering a specific kind of pressure it had not been designed to withstand. Not the pressure of a stronger enemy. He had faced stronger enemies and the architecture had held. This was different. This was the pressure of evidence that didn't fit the structure, arriving in pieces, each one small enough to rationalize, but accumulating into something that the structure was beginning to have difficulty containing. He pushed it back. He pushed it back because there was another explanation. There was always another explanation. The beam had been at minimum power. He had not yet committed his full force, and full force was qualitatively different from a single minimum power shot from a single ship. He had not yet asked the real question, which was not whether their screens could absorb a warning shot, but whether they could absorb everything simultaneously. The answer to that question was determined by physics, and physics did not make exceptions for impressive sensor readings. Subcommander Ice moved to his side. Sir? Sun looked at him. Ice held his gaze. I would like to formally register my concern about committing to a full engagement before we have clear analysis of what we are dealing with. The data we have suggests. The data we have, Sun said, is being produced by sensors that are reading a singularity inside a military vessel that is navigating under its own power. Either our sensors are being manipulated or we are being shown something designed to make us stand down without resistance. I have 41 years of experience with both of those situations, Drav. This is the second one. Ice held his gaze for another moment. And if it isn't, Sun looked back at the display at Harlow, still watching him with that expression that contained something he was still working to fully categorize. He thought about the number 43, about 31 years of preparation before anyone knew they existed. About a species that had spent 12 years in the galactic community, accepting every border, every limitation, every imposition quietly and without complaint. He thought about why something would do that. And then he put the thought away because the answer it was suggesting was the kind of answer that his experience had taught him was almost never correct, and on the rare occasions when it was the time for useful conclusions, had already passed. Coordinator Vron, he said, all ships, full assault formation, every vessel, complete weapons engagement, simultaneous. The bridge moved. That was the only way to describe what happened in the next 90 seconds. The bridge moved and 317 warships moved with it, a single organism of directed military intention, reorganizing into the configuration that the Vecthari Dominion had refined over 4,000 years of continuous naval warfare. The envelope formation expanded and integrated with the main force. Ships repositioned from containment to assault. Targeting systems shifted from passive acquisition to active fire control. Every weapon system on every vessel reached its ready state and reported back through the tactical network. 317 warships. All weapons, simultaneous. There was a moment in the final seconds before the order to fire when San opened the channel to Harlow one more time. She was still on the display, still watching. The disappointment in her expression had deepened into something that looked, he thought, almost like grief. Not for herself, for the situation. For what was about to happen because she had not been able to prevent it. Surrender your vessel, San said, immediately, or we will take it by force. Harlow closed her eyes. It lasted less than a second. When she opened them, the grief was still present, but something had settled behind it. The look of a professional who had done everything within her authority to produce a different outcome and had now arrived at the point where a different outcome was no longer available. She straightened in her command chair. Lieutenant Oran, she said, All defensive and offensive systems to full operational power. Authorization code Harlow 7 actual. The lieutenant's hands moved. Authorization confirmed, Admiral. All systems coming online. She looked directly at Son one final time. Grand Marshal, what you are about to see is not personal. It is not revenge. It is what happens when you force a Titan-class carrier to defend itself. She paused. You were warned. You were given every opportunity to choose peace. I want you to remember that. The channel closed, Fireson said. 317 Vecthari warships opened fire simultaneously. The visual feed from the Sovereign's Wrath's external cameras captured what happened next with a clarity that had the quality of a document rather than a memory. Every weapon system in the Third Armada's order of battle discharged at once. Particle beams, plasma lances, kinetic projectiles, missile salvos, directed energy weapons of 7 different classifications. The full inventory of 4,000 years of continuous Vecthari military development concentrated on a single point in space delivered by the largest battle group the Dominion had assembled in a generation. The energy release was sufficient to ignite a small moon. It reached the USS Resolute's defensive screens. It stopped. All of it. Everything. Every beam, every lance, every projectile, every missile. The space around the USS Resolute became a wall of accumulated light that lasted 3 full seconds, a sphere of destructive energy that had nowhere to go because the surface it was trying to cross did not permit passage. And then the light faded, and the USS Resolute was exactly where it had been at exactly the same shield output, with exactly the same sensor signature, as if 317 warships had not just devoted their full weapons capacity to its destruction. Impact assessment, Son heard himself saying. His sensor officer's voice was hollow in the way that voices became hollow when the person using them had disconnected from what they were reporting. 0 penetration across all weapon types. Shield fluctuation, he paused. 0.001%. Sir, our weapons are not registering as impacts. The interaction reads as contact with a fixed astronomical object. Increase firing rate, Son said. Maximum sustained output. The assault intensified. 317 warships pouring everything they had into a target that was not responding. The energy expenditure was massive enough that Son could see the power readings on the Sovereign's Wrath itself beginning to drop as the reactor struggled to maintain the rate of fire. The USS Resolute sat in the middle of it all, patient, untouched, wrapped in a field of force that was treating the combined might of the Vecthari Dominion's finest battle group as something slightly less significant than background radiation. And then it fired back. The hull of the USS Resolute was 43 kilometers long, and for the entirety of the engagement to this point, Son had been looking at its surface and seeing ship. He had categorized the geometry of its exterior as armor and sensors and structural elements, the dense functional architecture of a very large military vessel. He had been wrong. What the hull of the USS Resolute actually was, he now understood, was a weapons platform that had been waiting for permission. Sections of plating shifted and reconfigured. Ports opened along the vessel's length in sequences too rapid and too numerous to track individually. Systems that had been invisible at previous power levels became visible, simultaneously glowing with a pale blue light that his sensors translated as weapons active status, and the number of concurrent active signatures was high enough that his tactical display stopped trying to count them individually and defaulted to an aggregate reading. The first systems to engage were not the main batteries. They produced no visible beam, no detectable projectile, no measurable discharge that Son's sensors could characterize using existing classifications. Ships simply stopped. A Vecthari destroyer maneuvering for a better firing angle lost all power, simultaneously its engines and weapons going offline in the same instant, its hull intact, its crew alive, the vessel itself simply no longer functioning. A heavy cruiser attempting to break formation for an attack vector lost propulsion mid-thrust and began drifting dead in space. Another destroyer, 2 cruisers, a frigate, a dreadnought that had been pushing its reactor to maximum output suddenly went dark and silent, 400 meters of warship reduced to a very large, very expensive piece of debris. Electromagnetic pulse weapons, his weapons officer reported, his voice no longer steady. But not like anything in our database. They're reaching inside the ships, targeting specific systems, shutting down individual components without damaging the hull, sir. They are not trying to destroy those ships. They are preserving the crews. 37 ships disabled in 21 seconds, 64 in 40 seconds. 91 drifting dead in space, their crews sitting in darkness, breathing recycled air, waiting to find out whether they were going to survive this. And then the main batteries activated. They were mounted along the USS Resolute's central axis, a line of weapon systems that ran nearly the full 43-kilometer length of the ship's spine. Sun had been looking at them for 30 minutes and thinking he was looking at structural reinforcement. He had been wrong about that too. When they fired, they produced something for which Sun had no classification, not a beam, not a particle discharge, not plasma or kinetics, or any variant of directed energy that existed in the Dominion's weapons database. The closest analogy his mind could construct in the fraction of a second available was a lance of applied physics, a focused expression of some principle his scientists had not yet encountered, reaching across space and making a specific, unequivocal statement about whether a particular volume of space would continue to contain a Vecthari warship. The IDS Varath Kor was a heavy cruiser, 600 meters, 840 crew, 19 years in the Dominion service, 7 engagements, 4 of them with battle damage repaired and returned to service each time. The main battery touched it. For approximately 1/4 of a second, the cruiser's shields flared with the imposed energy. Its hull plating began to superheat along the point of contact. And then the IDS Varath Kor stopped existing. Not an explosion. Explosions left debris, expanding gas clouds, radiation signatures, the wreckage of structure. Where the IDS Varath Kor had been, there was nothing. No debris, no radiation pulse, no evidence that 840 people and 600 meters of warship had occupied that location. The main battery fired again. The IDS Coravan, gone. The IDS Sorrows Point, gone. The IDS Tharic Ven, gone. Each shot traveled faster than point defense systems could engage. Each targeting solution was executed with a precision that his own gunners, watching the data in real time, could only categorize as perfect. The USS Resolute was not saturating an area hoping to catch targets. It was selecting, acquiring, and eliminating specific vessels in a sequence that San realized with a cold that went all the way through him was calculated to remove the ships most likely to threaten the civilian habitats if the engagement continued. It was protecting the colonial habitats while it destroyed his fleet. Casualty reports, Sun heard himself say. Vraan's voice was barely audible over the alarms flooding every channel. 152 ships confirmed destroyed. 91 ships disabled. 74 vessels still functional. She stopped. Grand Marshal, we cannot fight this. We cannot survive this. Sun stared at his tactical display. The Third Armada's formation markers were disappearing faster than his mind could fully process their individual losses. Ships that had been symbols of Dominion power for years, for decades, were simply ceasing to appear on the display. The formation geometry that had seemed so absolute 20 minutes ago was dissolving into isolated clusters of vessels attempting evasive maneuvers that the USS Resolute's targeting systems were treating as minor inconveniences in an otherwise orderly operation. Sir, the sensor officer said, and something in his voice was different from everything that had come before. The human vessel is ceasing fire. Sun looked up from the display. On the tactical display, the weapons discharge signatures from the USS Resolute had stopped. 74 of his ships were still functional. The USS Resolute could have continued. It had stopped because it had made a decision to stop. Fleet Admiral Harlow is hailing us, I said. His voice was very quiet. On screen, Harlow appeared. She looked tired. The professional composure was intact, the spine straight, the hands steady, but around the eyes and in the set of her face there was the accumulated weight of someone who had just done something they had genuinely hoped they would never have to do. She looked at him for a long moment before she spoke. Grand Marshal San, she said, I am going to tell you several things and I need you to listen carefully. She paused. I have just disabled or destroyed 243 of your vessels. I did this in 2 minutes and 47 seconds while operating at approximately 14% of this vessel's maximum combat capability. My weapon systems have not reached full operating temperature. My shields have not been meaningfully tested. My crew has not gone to full battle stations. Another pause. Longer. The USS Resolute is one of 74 Titan-class carriers in the Terran Compact Naval Command. That is the Titan class alone. We have 6 additional vessel classifications in our order of battle, ranging from destroyer-class ships that outmatch your dreadnoughts individually to command vessels that make this ship look modest. We have been part of the galactic community for 12 years. In that time, we have watched. We have learned. We have built a navy specifically designed to ensure that humanity cannot be threatened by any force this galaxy can assemble. And we kept it quiet because we hoped, sincerely hoped, that we would never need to use it. She leaned forward slightly. You asked, in effect, what one fleet could do against 300 ships. Grand Marshal, to have just shown you what one ship can do operating below 15% capacity with orders to minimize casualties wherever operationally possible. She straightened. Your remaining vessels are free to leave the threshold system. Collect your disabled ships. Recover your crews. But understand this clearly. This system belongs to the Terran Compact. It has always belonged to the Terran Compact. And if the Vecthari Dominion violates our borders again, if you threaten our people again, if you make the mistake of assuming that our preference for peace indicates an inability to wage war. She paused, and what moved into her voice was not a threat, but a statement of plain fact delivered by someone who had no reason to make it anything other than plain. I will bring all 74 Titan-class carriers to your home system, and I will give your government exactly the same choice I gave you today. She held his gaze. You have 1 hour to begin your withdrawal. I suggest you use it well. The channel closed. San sat in his command throne. Around him, the bridge processed the information of its own defeat. Damage reports from ships that were still transmitting. Silence from the 252 that weren't. Emergency beacon signals from 91 disabled vessels, where thousands of crew members were waiting in the dark to find out what came next. Ice was standing beside him. He had not moved since the firing stopped. What are your orders, Sir San looked at the display. Looked at what was left of the Third Armada. Looked at the USS Resolute, which had not moved from its orbital position above Threshold Prime, sitting between his remaining ships and the colonial habitats, with the patient permanence of something that would still be there long after his decision had been made. Signal all surviving vessels, he said. He heard his own voice and was surprised by what was in it. Not defeat, not anger, something quieter than either. Full retreat. Rescue operations for all disabled vessels. We are leaving. He stood from his command throne and walked to the viewport for the last time as a commander with a fleet behind him, and the threshold system Ice said carefully. Sun looked at Threshold Prime hanging in the middle distance, patient and unchanged, its rings still catching the light. The colonial habitat still orbited it. The USS Resolute still guarded it. The threshold system belongs to the Terran Compact, he said. It always did. We were simply too certain to understand what that meant. The rescue shuttles launched before San had finished composing the withdrawal order. 23 of them moving in coordinated sequence from the USS Resolute's ventral bay doors, each one following a precise flight path toward a specific disabled Vecthari vessel. They did not ask permission. They did not hail the Sovereign's wrath to announce their intentions or request clearance or wait for any acknowledgement from the Dominion command structure. They simply went with the quiet efficiency of a plan that had been prepared well in advance of the engagement by people who had calculated with apparent certainty that there would be disabled ships requiring assistance before the day was finished. Sun watched them on the tactical display. 23 small contacts fanning outward from the USS Resolute toward 91 dark ships drifting in the debris field of the Third Armada. Each shuttle carried a medical team and a technical crew. IS confirmed this from the communication intercepts. His signals officer was pulling from the Terran Compact's operational frequencies, which were no longer encrypted at high levels, as if the concealment of intentions had become unnecessary. They were saving his people, not as leverage, not as a gesture timed to coincide with the demand. The shuttles had launched before any negotiation about the fate of the disabled crews had taken place, before anyone had made any agreement about anything. The Terran Compact's rescue operation had begun at the moment the USS Resolute stopped firing, and it had begun because that was what they did automatically without being asked, apparently without needing to decide. Sun stood at the viewport and watched the 23 shuttle contacts reach their assigned vessels one by one, and thought about a species that built overwhelming weapons and then spent the aftermath of using them, saving the people those weapons had put at risk. He thought about that for the 8 hours it took the Sovereign's wrath to reach the nearest stable jump point. Then he went to stand before the Arch-Chancellor. The emergency session of the Vecthari Dominion War Council convened in the Great Hall of the Imperial Command Complex on Vecthar Prime, and the room itself seemed to understand the weight of what it was being asked to contain. The hall was built for triumph. Its architecture spoke the language of conquest, high ceilings, and deep chambers and walls carrying the carved records of 4,000 years of Dominion military history. Every major victory was here. Every expansion. Every species brought into the Dominion's order, peacefully or otherwise. There were no records of defeats because there had not been defeats worth recording. Until today. Grand Marshal Vekthar San stood at the center of the chamber without his ceremonial armor. That detail alone communicated something to every member of the council assembled above him. He had not worn the armor because wearing it would have been a lie, and he was done with the specific category of lies that assumed the situation was other than it was. Holographic projections filled the air around him. Wreckage fields where the Third Armada had stood. Disabled vessels being attended by Terran compact rescue craft. The engagement footage itself running on a continuous loop from 17 different sensor perspectives, each one showing the same sequence from a different angle, each one arriving at the same conclusion. Arch-Chancellor Morvan Seal sat at the head of the council table. He was the oldest member of the Dominion's governing body, his scales carrying the deep silver of advanced age, his eyes holding the quality of someone who had outlived most of their certainties and learned to update the ones that remained. He had governed for 31 years. He had overseen the Dominion's expansion through 9 new systems. He had signed the Haversham Colonial Accords 11 years ago, without it was now apparent fully understanding what he was signing into. He watched the engagement footage without speaking until it ended. Then he watched it again. When he finally looked down at Sun, his voice carried no anger. Anger would have meant the situation was still within a range he knew how to respond to. What his voice carried instead was the careful neutrality of a man who had been operating on a set of assumptions for a very long time and had just been presented with evidence that the assumptions were wrong from the foundation. 152 ships confirmed destroyed, Seal said. 91 disabled and currently under Terran compact rescue operations. 243 vessels, lost or incapacitated in total, Grand Marshal. He let the arithmetic settle over the chamber like smoke. 6,891 confirmed dead. The largest military loss in Dominion recorded history. His eyes settled on Sun, against one ship, in 2 minutes and 47 seconds. Yes, Arch-Chancellor Sun said. There was nothing to add to that. The numbers said everything that needed to be said. Seal turned to the figure standing to the right of the council table. Fleet analyst Yara Kell was the head of the Dominion's Military Intelligence Division, a position she had held for 9 years. She was not a large presence in the room. She had the quality of someone who had spent a long career making herself easy to overlook in situations where being overlooked was an advantage, which was most situations in her profession. But when she spoke, the room listened because she had never been wrong about anything that mattered. I have completed the cross-referenced analysis of the engagement data, Kell said. She activated her display and numbers populated the air above the council table. 17 independent sensor sources, including long-range observation posts that were not part of the combat formation and therefore not subject to any potential interference. Civilian shipping logs from 3 vessels transiting the outer system at the time of the engagement. Damage assessments from the surviving and recovered ships. She let the data settle before continuing. The performance of the USS Resolute during the engagement exceeded the technical specifications transmitted by Fleet Admiral Harlow by 14% across all measured weapons categories. Power generation capacity was undersold in the transmitted datum by 21%. She paused. This was not an error. The specifications they provided were accurate. They simply rounded down. The intent appears to have been to give us sufficient information to make a rational decision without producing a level of fear that would override rational decision-making entirely. She moved to the next projection. A probability assessment appeared. A single USS Resolute operating at full combat capacity, she said, rather than the 14% capacity Admiral Harlow reported using during the engagement, has a projected probability of 97.3% of eliminating the Dominion's home fleet in a single engagement. She let that number stand on its own for a moment. If the Terran Compact were to deploy all 74 confirmed Titan-class vessels simultaneously against a combined force assembled from every major military power in the known galaxy, the combined force numbers approximately 4,847 capital ships. The projected Terran Compact victory probability in that engagement is 78%. War Coordinator Driven Soth at the far end of the table said something under his breath. That number, Kell continued, assumes the Titan class is the most capable vessel type in the Terran Compact's order of battle. Admiral Harlow referenced a command vessel classification she called Leviathan class, described as significantly larger and more capable than the Titan class. She paused. We have no data on those vessels. We have no data on them because they have never been deployed, which means we have never given them sufficient reason to deploy them. The silence that followed that statement lasted long enough that Son became aware of the building's environmental systems, the faint circulation of processed air, the distant hum of power running through walls that had been built to celebrate a kind of power that was no longer the most significant kind in the galaxy. Seal broke it. The question I need answered, he said, is not about the ships we know about. He looked at Kel directly. How did they build 74 vessels of that scale without anyone noticing? His voice carried the genuine puzzlement of a man who had run a significant intelligence apparatus for 3 decades and understood what that apparatus should have been capable of detecting. The industrial infrastructure required, the resource commitment. How does something of that magnitude remain invisible for 43 years? Kel pulled up a new display. Star charts. Human territorial space, the modest sphere of systems that the Terran Compact had been permitted to claim across 12 years of galactic community membership. They showed us what they wanted us to see, she said. Small colonial installations, modest manufacturing capacity, trade vessels that looked appropriately primitive for a species at their apparent stage of development. They participated in galactic councils. They accepted the borders placed on them. They purchased resources at fair market rates rather than competing for them. They presented consistently and convincingly as a species in the early stages of finding its place in a larger civilization. She zoomed to the outer boundary of Terran space, where long-range observation data had categorized a series of installations as low-priority mining operations and civilian infrastructure. The construction facilities were here, she said. They have been here for the entire 12 years of our awareness of their species and for 31 years before that. When we look at them with standard observation protocols, they read as civilian heavy industry. When we apply military construction analysis templates to the same data, the display recalculated itself. What resolves is the largest continuous shipbuilding operation in the history of the known galaxy. The images shifted. What had appeared as industrial platforms and processing stations resolved under the new analytical lens into the unmistakable geometry of naval construction yards, scaled to build vessels that were 43 kilometers long. And to do it in sufficient quantity that 74 of them now existed at positions throughout human space that the Dominion had never adequately mapped. They were hiding, Son said. Every head in the room turned to him. For 43 years, he continued. Before we knew they existed, before anyone in this galaxy knew they existed, they were already building, already preparing. They studied our history, our methods of expansion, our doctrine for handling species who couldn't adequately defend their territory. They read about what happened to civilizations who lacked the capacity to make aggression against them too costly to pursue. And they made a decision as a species before they ever introduced themselves that they were going to ensure that calculation was never made about them. He let that sit. They showed us a version of themselves that fit our expectations, he said. Cautious, limited, manageable. They accepted every imposition without pushing back because pushing back would have required demonstrating capabilities they weren't ready to reveal. Every time we assumed they were weak, we were measuring them against what they allowed us to see, not against what they were. Seal was watching him carefully. And Admiral Harlow, you spoke with her directly. Twice, Son said. He thought about her face. The disappointment. The cold, settled professional resolve that had replaced it when she understood that the engagement was unavoidable. She gave us every opportunity to withdraw. She tried to prevent the engagement even after we fired on her vessel an act of war by any recognized standard. She still tried to minimize what followed. When she stopped firing, it was not because we had done anything to compel her to stop. She stopped because she had made a decision about how much force this situation required, and she had applied that amount, and she was done. He paused. She sent rescue shuttles before we had even confirmed our withdrawal, he said. 4,312 of my people are alive right now because the Terran Compact built a rescue capacity into an offensive combat deployment. They planned for the survivors before they fired a single shot. The chamber was quiet again, and this time the quality of the quiet was different from the quiet that had preceded the battle. That silence had been the silence of certainty. This was the silence of people in the process of revising the framework through which they understood everything. This is not, Son said, the behavior of a species that wants to conquer. This is the behavior of a species that built an overwhelming military force specifically so they would never have to use it continuously. They want to be left alone. They have spent 43 years and an extraordinary fraction of their total economic output, ensuring that being left alone is not something they need to negotiate for or depend on anyone else's restraint to maintain. They built the cost of threatening them so high that only the catastrophically misinformed would attempt it. He looked at Seal. We were catastrophically misinformed. The personal message from Fleet Admiral Harlow arrived 6 hours after the Sovereign's wrath reached Vecthar Prime. It came through standard diplomatic channels properly encrypted with appropriate authentication codes, as though Harlow had decided that having bypassed the Dominion's communication security once for effect, she was content to use the front door thereafter. Sun received it in his private quarters aboard the ship, which was still in the orbital shipyards undergoing repair. He had been looking at the message notification for 20 minutes before he opened it. Harlow appeared on his screen. She was not on the bridge of the USS Resolute. She was in an office small and functional, with the particular quality of a workspace belonging to someone who spent very little time in it. Through the window behind her desk, the Terminator line of Earth moved slowly across the planet's surface, day giving way to darkness from east to west, blue atmosphere curving above a world that had produced something which had been invisible for 43 years, and had then in 2 minutes and 47 seconds become the most significant fact in galactic politics. Grand Marshal Sans, she said, I am recording this message 3 days after the Threshold system engagement. I want to tell you some things I could not say during our confrontation. Things I think you have earned the right to know. She paused. Grand Marshal, she said, you already know the USS Resolute's age. You know what she demonstrated at 14% capacity. I am not going to repeat what you have already seen. What I want you to understand is the reason it exists. She leaned back slightly in her chair. 11 years before we announced ourselves to the galactic community, we read your history, all of it. Every species absorbed, displaced, or erased because their resistance was insufficient to change a stronger power's calculation about the value of their territory. We read it carefully and thoroughly. We read it the way people read a warning they intend to take seriously. We made a decision as a species, she said, not a government decision. A species decision, and it was not made lightly. We closed hospitals. We deferred schools and infrastructure and the ordinary improvements that make daily life better. We made our people poorer for 20 years, and we did it with their full understanding of why, because they had read the same history and reached the same conclusions. 15% of the Terran Compact's total economic output sustained for 2 decades diverted to a construction program that appeared in every public record as civilian infrastructure in the outer solar system. The result is the USS Resolute, and 73 ships built after her, each one more capable than the last. She is the oldest. She is the weakest. The newest vessels in our order of battle outperform her by 22% across all categories, and the yards have not stopped. She met the camera directly. I want to close a question that I suspect has been bothering you since the beginning of this, she said. The phrase one fleet in our original diplomatic communication was not rhetorical. In Terran Compact naval doctrine, a Titan-class carrier is classified as an independent fleet unit. The designation is technical, not numerical. It refers to the vessel's capacity to conduct full-spectrum naval operations without support from additional assets. The USS Resolute is under our doctrine a fleet in the same sense that a city is a population center. The term is accurate regardless of how many physical components are involved. She paused. We sent one fleet. That is precisely what we said we would do. We have never made a military statement to your government that was imprecise. She stood and moved to the window, and for a moment she stood with her back to the camera, looking at Earth rotating slowly in the last of the afternoon light. We don't want your territory, she said. We don't want to govern your people or restructure your civilization or impose anything on anyone. We want what we have always wanted since the moment we decided to announce our existence to a galaxy we had already determined was dangerous. We want to be left alone. We want our colonists to live in safety. We want our borders to mean something. She turned back to face the camera. Your remaining ships will encounter no interference on their return to Dominion space. The disabled vessels we assisted will be returned to Dominion custody. We will not be seeking reparations or additional concessions beyond the return of the Threshold system and the formal apology your government is composing. We consider this matter resolved. She was quiet for a moment that felt, even on a recording, like something considered. I hope very much, Grand Marshal, that nothing like this is ever necessary again. Not because we cannot do it, but because I have seen in our own history what it costs a species to spend too long doing things that are necessary. I would like humanity to be spared that particular cost for as long as possible. The message ended. Sun sat in the quiet of his quarters for a long time. On the screen, the display had returned to the standard interface, waiting for the next instruction. Outside the viewport, Vector Prime rotated in the middle distance, its surface lights visible in the dark sector where the orbital night was deepest. He had known. Not consciously, not in any form he could have articulated and acted on in time. But the information had been there in pieces, each one individually explainable, each one individually dismissible, and he had dismissed each one because he had not wanted to assemble them into what they were pointing toward. The 43 years. The precision of the language. The absence of fear in Petrovan's eyes. The fact that the USS Resolute had already been moving before the deadline expired. He had known that something was different, and he had decided that 41 years of certainty was a more reliable guide than the details that were trying to tell him otherwise. He had made the same mistake that the Dominion had been making about humanity for 12 years. He had measured them against his expectations rather than against what was actually present. He had seen a species that accepted its limitations quietly and concluded that the acceptance reflected genuine limitation, when in fact it reflected something else entirely. It reflected a species that had thought further ahead than he had, that had understood something about the long calculation of survival that his 4,000 years of institutional history had not prepared him to recognize. They had been patient, not the patience of the weak, which is the patience of those who have no other option, the patience of the strong, which is the patience of those who understand that the right moment properly awaited costs less than the wrong moment hastily seized. The footage of the Threshold system engagement reached every corner of the known galaxy within 3 weeks. Not through official diplomatic channels, not through the formal military assessment networks that governments use to share strategic intelligence with counterparts. It traveled the way genuinely transformative information always traveled, through the informal infrastructure of people who needed to know when the thing they thought was true had stopped being true. A signals officer on the Pelthian Confederation border patrol vessel received it from a contact at a neutral trading station and watched it 4 times before forwarding it to his command. A Corvathi Unity strategic analyst received it embedded in routine shipping data and spent 6 hours running verification checks before accepting that the readings were authentic. Independent observers at a dozen free ports confirmed the sensor data against their own long-range recordings of the engagement. The conclusion was always the same. In the Pelthian Confederation, the Hive Command that had directed 3 centuries of biological warfare across 4 sectors reviewed the footage. The Pelthian swarm doctrine was built on superiority through numbers and regenerative capacity. Numbers could replace losses. Biological systems could repair damage. The mathematical foundation of their military philosophy rested on the assumption that against sufficient mass applied over sufficient time, any enemy could be worn down to ineffective resistance. The footage from Threshold showed what happened to that philosophy when it encountered something that did not respond to attrition the way the philosophy assumed everything did. The Swarm Queens sent emissaries to the Terran Compact within 11 days. The communication they sent ahead of the emissaries was brief, and for entities that typically express themselves through elaborate chemical signaling and threat display, remarkably direct. We wish to discuss terms of mutual respect. We have reviewed the Threshold engagement. We have no interest in occupying the position the Vecthari Dominion occupied at any point during those 2 minutes and 47 seconds. In the Corvathi Unity's strategic assessment centers, military analysts who had spent careers studying weapons technology and energy physics watched the USS Resolute's defensive screen absorb the combined fire of 317 warships and ran the numbers through every analytical framework they possessed. The frameworks did not produce a coherent answer. The energy interaction was not a more efficient version of known shield technology. It was not a scaled-up application of defensive principles they already understood. It was something operating on principles their physics had not yet derived, and the gap between what they knew and what they were watching was not a matter of decades. It was something wider and less bridgeable than that. In the neutral stations and free ports where merchants and captains gathered to conduct business and exchange information, the story accumulated as important stories always did. What remained consistent across every version, in every language, in every species retelling, was the essential shape of it. 1 ship, 1 warning ignored, 2 minutes and 47 seconds, and then the choice made without being asked to stop. That last part seemed to matter to people in a way that surprised them when they tried to explain why. 3 weeks after the engagement, Sun stood at the viewport of the Sovereign's Wrath for the last time as its commanding officer. The transfer of command was scheduled for the following morning. His resignation from active service had been accepted by Arch-Chancellor Seal, with the particular formality that the Dominion used to mark moments it wanted history to record accurately. The acceptance communicated neither blame nor absolution, which was probably the most honest response available. A message arrived from ICE from his own quarters, which was unusual at this hour. Sir, the diplomatic delegation has confirmed. Negotiations begin in 6 days. The Terran Compact's representative will be Ambassador Petrovane. Son read the name twice. He thought about the young woman who had delivered the ultimatum, with the eyes of someone who had known with complete certainty that the leverage she was holding was exactly what she had claimed it was. He sent back a single line. Noted. Thank you, Drab. He put the communicator down and turned back to the viewport. There was one more thing he wanted to do before he wrote the report that Seal would read to the full council in the morning. Not for strategic purposes, for his own understanding. He pulled up the long-range sensor archive and applied the military construction analysis template that Kell had used during the council session. He pointed it at the 17 facility coordinates that Harlow had attached to her message. The facilities resolved, not mining operations, not civilian infrastructure. Shipyards, massive and active, built at a scale that corresponded to the vessels they had been designed to produce. And in the deep space between the facilities, other contacts resolved as he refined the analysis. Warships on patrol routes moving in patterns that describe borders and perimeters and the patient, continuous maintenance of a defensive posture that had been in place undetected for longer than anyone had realized. He looked at the industrial capacity for a long time, at the yards still active, at the ships still being built, at the scale of what had been quietly, patiently assembled over 4 decades by a species that had read the history of everyone who came before them and decided collectively that they were going to be different. Then he closed the display and went to write the report. He wrote it carefully. He wrote it completely. He did not soften anything or qualify anything in a way designed to make it easier to receive, because the people who needed to understand this thing needed to understand it fully, and because the 6,891 dead deserved a record that told the truth about how they had died and why. He was finished before dawn. He set down the stylus and looked at the first line he had written, the line that would become the permanent opening of the Dominion's most significant strategic reassessment in 4,000 years of recorded history. Humanity was not discovered. Humanity allowed itself to be found. These are not the same thing, and understanding the difference is now the first obligation of every officer in this fleet. He read it over once, then he set it aside and walked to the viewport for the last time. Outside, Vecthar Prime turned slowly in the deep, and the stars held their positions without comment. They had watched empires before. They were patient witnesses to the thing that always came eventually, the morning when the species that believed itself to be the apex of all possible force encountered the specific evidence that it was not. What was different this time, Sun thought, was not the scale of the defeat. Empires had been defeated before. What was different was the restraint. The 23 rescue shuttles, the specifications rounded down to avoid total panic. The 2 minutes and 47 seconds that could have been 8 minutes could have been the complete and methodical elimination of every Dominion vessel in the system, but had been precisely what was necessary and nothing beyond it. That precision was not accidental. It was doctrine. It was the product of 43 years of deliberate preparation by a species that had decided before it introduced itself to anyone exactly what kind of force it was willing to be and what kind it was not. They had built a capacity for absolute destruction and surrounded it with the discipline never to use more than the situation required. Sun had spent 41 years believing that power was demonstrated through its application. He understood now that there was a different kind of power, rarer and more difficult to build, demonstrated through the precision of its restraint. Somewhere out there, the USS Resolute was returning to its base, its crew of 18,000 completing their post-engagement protocols with the same calm professionalism they had brought to the engagement itself. Somewhere out there, 73 more vessels like it waited in positions. The Dominion's observation posts were only now beginning to accurately locate. And in the shipyards that were still active, still building, the fleet continued to grow. He thought about Harlow standing at her window, watching Earth turn. He thought about the 20 years of economic sacrifice, the closed hospitals and deferred schools, the collective decision made by an entire species before it had introduced itself to anyone. He thought about what it meant to look at 4,000 years of galactic history and decide with that full record in front of you that you were going to be the species that broke the pattern, not by conquering, not by expanding, by becoming so capable of defending what was theirs that the calculation of attacking them would never resolve in favor of the attacker. He thought it was in its own way the most significant military achievement he had ever encountered. Not the weapons or the shields or the technology that his scientists would spend years trying to understand. The patience, the discipline, the 43 years of preparation carried out in silence by people who believed correctly that the work itself was more important than the recognition of it. The stars did not move. Below him, Vecthar Prime continued its rotation, indifferent and ancient, carrying on its surface the records of an empire that had believed itself to be the final word on the subject of power. The empire was still there. It would adapt, as Seal had said. It would rebuild its relationship with humanity on different terms. It would send Petra Vane a delegation that listened rather than dictated, and it would sign whatever agreements were put before it with the full understanding of what the alternative looked like. But Sun knew standing at that viewport in the last quiet hour before the transfer of command that something had ended the night the USS Resolute held its position above Threshold Prime and chose when it could have continued to stop. Not the Dominion would survive. What had ended was the assumption that the known galaxy had been fully mapped, that the order of power had been established, that the species who moved quietly and accepted their limitations and never pushed back against what was imposed on them were doing so because they had no other option. The stars outside the viewport had watched that assumption end, and they had watched it end without drama, without ceremony, in the quiet space between a weapon that had fired and a weapon that had chosen not to. That San thought was the lesson that 4,000 years of Dominion history had not prepared anyone to teach. He turned from the viewport, picked up the report, and walked toward the door. Behind him, the stars remained where they had always been, patient, constant, waiting as they had always waited for the next species to learn what the ones before them had learned, or to learn what this one had learned instead. That the strongest force in the galaxy was not the one that destroyed without limit. It was the one that could and didn't.